I'm not sure, if
I
anyone.
believe there is some sort of issue with Swati, but yeah, let's go ahead.
Sure.
I'm really excited to have Mehul, aka Codedamn, onto with us. He's been one of the biggest influential peoples out there, and I personally, being a developer, follow him quite a lot. Yes. Yeah,
Sure.
it's your them all to
Thank you
you.
so much, Ritesh. All right, let's start this 40-50 minute session. And I hope that this session would be something where we would learn and discuss about a few things which you would not be able to learn in a traditional video-based course setting. So this would be a hands-on um, live session where I would want you to interact and ask questions as well along the way. And I would pick up a few questions to answer at the end. So, as the title of the session is How Web Works, what I want to discuss is briefly how really what happens when you are browsing a website or when you open a website or when you're writing a code for a front end app, let's say in React or Angular. What exactly does it take for your website to go live, and how does your browser work when it starts to communicate with any particular website, whether that's your deployed URL, whether that's codedamn.com, whether that's google.com. So I have a very small presentation which we can use um, as a helper sort of thing. So let's start with this. We will dive into examples and everything. Just let me know if everyone can see my screen. Yeah. Okay. So what we're going to be discussing in this video, in this webinar, basically not a video exactly, is how basically what happens when you write google.com in your browser, or what happens when you write codedamn.com, and where does really your role come as a developer. Because the first part is actually deploying the site, and the second part is what you do that is visible to the browser. So before getting into that, just wanted to quickly introduce myself as well. I have been into the web development field for like almost 8 years now. I started very young when I was in class sixth or seventh, and I just messed around a lot with blogger.com and WordPress, creating all those websites and blogs. That actually got me started with HTML and CSS because I was always curious on how I could rearrange a certain part of the website, or maybe change a color, or maybe change a little bit of layout, or add a subscribe widget. So things like these got me introduced to HTML and CSS because that's like an inevitable thing you need to learn. But further on top of that, when I discovered JavaScript, I got introduced to front end development. Then there was PHP. Then there was like a lot of unlocked power, right? So I felt like pretty much I could do a lot of things which I see on internet, building a file uploading service or building a small login functionality which these social media websites implement. So that's how I got introduced to web development. It was all fun and game for me, to be honest. There was no real pressure of getting a placement or clearing an interview and so on. So I explored a lot. One of the areas where I did a lot of work was freelancing as well on Fiverr. So I did close to like 700, 800 total projects, maybe 1,000 plus if you include all the other websites. I'm also the author of two books, one on JavaScript and one on React. I have been to WWDC'19 as a scholar. So that was like something which requires you to build a Swift application. But because I was already familiar with JavaScript and Node.js and these languages, it was relatively easier to learn the other language syntax as well. And finally, I'm the founder of a platform called as Scordam, where you can learn to program interactively. So that means you're not just watching videos and reading articles, but you're actually practicing whatever you are learning within the browser itself. That practicing includes building projects, completing challenges and labs, and you don't have to leave your browser. That means everything is provided to you in a single setting. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about what web is today, right? So all of us use web in some form or another, right? If you're on a laptop, if you are using Chrome or Firefox or any sort of modern browser and browsing websites, chances are you are opening a website with its name, right? You are writing google.com, or you're writing codedamn.com or any sort of URL, you don't necessarily write IP addresses or weird strings in this URL place. So that is just like the initial part of the equation, how you start your browser to browse a website. But browser is much more than that today. Browser is almost like becoming an operating system. I'm not sure like how many of you have heard, but Adobe Photoshop is also like bringing their Photoshop, the one of the best tools out there for designers on the web, right? So it's almost like in a few months time, maybe you will just send a link to someone and Photoshop would open right inside your browser. So it's almost like browser is now becoming an operating system with so much technology packed in and so much features packed in, and it is like the primary way to browse the web. But I still feel like the core fundamentals are still the same. It is very easy to like just get overwhelmed with so many new functionalities and so many things. But I do feel like most developers, if you look around, would not even know the core fundamentals of how web is really working. So that's what we want to discuss in this webinar a bit. So the core fundamentals does involve these three components. The first, these two ones are front end and back end, obviously. And I'm assuming that you people would have a little bit of understanding about the terminology, because we would be going a little bit faster on the terminology part because I want to spend more time on these things and Q&A. So front end and back end basically just means that this is the part which appears to the user, and this is the part which sends this part to the user, right? So the way internet works is two computers are always communicating. The back end one is your server, which you completely own. The front end one, in case of browsers, is this web browser like setting where this backend sends some information. Now, how does that information is sent? That is done through a protocol called HTTP, right? You would have seen, if we go to any website, you can see you have an HTTPS over here. Now, what does this HTTPS means? It's just HTTP, but a secure version of HTTP, right? So on every single website you visit, Facebook, Google, anything on the web, you will see this HTTP here in the URL. So this means this HTTP is a protocol, a hypertext transfer protocol on which the modern web is built. And this is like a plain text protocol. We'll also see like what does this really mean. And a protocol, just for people who are not aware about it, it's just like a language, or not exactly a language, but it's like rules. So in English you have grammar, right? You can form any sort of sentences, but that doesn't mean that they all would make sense. Similarly, with HTTP you can do a lot of things, but only a few set of instructions would make some sense to the back end and front end. So hypertext transfer protocol just lays down a list of rules you need to follow when communicating on the web, right? On the URLs and browsing websites and so on. So DNS is again a little bit lower compared to what HTTP is. So DNS goes on the implementation side, where we say that, hey, you're browsing codedamn.com, but where in the world is this computer really, right? So figuring out that part is the very first thing. So DNS and networking, this is also something which we will discuss. So let's start with actually the secret sauce of what you should do if you want to become a great developer, because that's like the first thing we are doing here is we are trying to question everything, right? We started with what is web today. We are seeing that, hey, web is something which we mostly browse with a browser, and browser is like a very complicated thing, but the core fundamentals are same. Then we look at what are the components, and then we start questioning why, what is DNS, how it is working, what are network requests. So having that curiosity mindset and having the ability to question everything at some point, you should not be like questioning everything at all the times, because some things do have some prerequisites, so you have to learn them. But not taking anything for the sake of it is like something which great developers do. That means they always try to question everything at some point. So let's start with a little bit of demonstration of the HTTP and DNS layer. And for this exercise, what you can do is, if you're on laptop, if you're on desktop, you can open any website, not just Codedamn, just go to any other website and right click and go to this inspect element. Now this inspector, if you have never really browsed it, it might seem a little too techy, but it's actually under the hood look of the page which the browser sees, right? Now browser, technically speaking, sees this view page source. If you go to this view page source, technically sees all this HTML code on the first load. But like I said, browser is a very complicated machine, right? And if you want to run Photoshop, for example, on a web page, you cannot just assume that this is all it would take, just sending a simple string and browser just displaying that simple string here, right? Browser has to parse that, it has to understand that, it has to optimize that, it has to do a lot of things. So, but the first thing a browser does is, when you write codedamn.com, and hit enter, if you go to this networks tab here, and if you go to this doc mode here, on any website, you can choose any website. You can click on this first link, which is, most likely the website link which you have chosen. And you're going to see that we have something interesting happening over here. So we have the request URL, and we have the request method and this and that. But what exactly happens here, in order for this browser to really communicate with codedamn.com, it needs an IP address, right? And in case of Codedamn, it's the 7676.21.21, right? So why does this need an IP address? Because if you know a little bit about computers, you know that computers don't really communicate with strings, they communicate with numbers, so it needs a number representation. And what we have come across as a what developers did is that they created this notion of domain name system. So we understood that, hey, it is easier for people to remember names instead of these numbers, right? And this is probably a simpler number, 76.21.21, but IPs could be pretty much anything random, right? 143.68.72. Anything. So we don't want people to remember that. So the way this DNS works is, your browser on the first go says that, hey, I want to browse this website codedamn.com. The browser goes to your operating system, right, which is Windows, Mac, Linux, anything. And it asks the operating system, do you have this IP for codedamn.com? If your operating system does has that in its cache, which most probably it would not if you're loading it for the first time, then OS would say that I don't have this, but let me try to ask ISP, right? And ISP is your internet service provider. So the next request goes to your ISP's DNS resolver. This is basically a DNS resolver. I'm not sure like how many have you really have set up a DNS resolver sometime when you go to the settings of your OS and set this 8.8.8.8 or anything which your ISP provides. But that particular thing is called as a DNS resolver. So we are assuming, like in this case, let's assume there is no caching involved anywhere so that we complete a full route. So the DNS resolver, the next time, goes ahead and say that your operating system makes a request to this DNS resolver. This DNS resolver says that I don't have the IP, but let me ask the root name server, right? Now this root name server right here is a very interesting server, because this root name server, there are only 13 servers in the world, right? And these servers are distributed strategically. Now, what does that mean? That means that these servers are the servers which never really contain an IP address of a domain, but they do contain the name servers of the top level domain. So what does that mean? That means that in case of Codedamn, you can see that we are using a .com at the end, right? So one of the 13 servers out of this DNS resolver would reach out to, and it will say, this DNS resolver would say that, hey, let's reframe this DNS to root name server, that hey, I have I have a .com domain, where to find it. Codedamn.com basically. So what this root name server would do is that it'll say that I don't know the IP address of codedamn.com, but I know a name server which would probably know it, right? In this case, we use a Wurzel DNS, right? So root name server would point it to Wurzel DNS, and what Wurzel would say in this case, Wurzel is the Codedamm's hosting provider, which also handles like Wurzel and AWS basically. So this would finally say that, hey, for codedamn.com, you should just send, you should just resolve to 76762121, right? And then this whole chain of response would be cached. That means root name server would probably cache this. DNS resolver right here would cache this response for codedamn.com. Your operating system would cache this, and your browser might also cache this response. So what exactly is happening here is that once you get this response for a domain, you cache it because you don't want this whole journey to happen again. Although this is like very fast, still it's like just a matter of a few seconds, but you still don't want this to happen because why not? Why should you just traverse the whole thing again and again? So this is the very first way your computer actually establishes a connection. Once it has an IP address, it connects to that computer through internet because now it has a routable path. Now it has a location on the map where it can connect. So right here, the second thing which happens is that once it got the IP address, it will send an HTTP request. At this point, it will send an HTTP request. And the way this request is sent, you can pretty much just take a look at, even if you're browsing on any other website or any other web page, there's a section here called as request headers within this area. And right here, the important part here is this part where you specify the host of the website, where what kind of website you are accessing. And this Chrome DevTools is not really showing me a host header, but ideally there would be a host header here which would say this codedamn.com, which shows as authority in this case. But this host of codedamn.com, what it would mean is that once it goes to the server 76762121, this server, this IP address might be hosting a ton of websites, right? So it needs to distinguish which website you're trying to access. And the way it does that is in the HTTP request. So in the HTTP request, you do say that, hey, my host is codedamn.com, and then you specify all the other things, method, and all the additional headers. And these additional headers are basically information which help you even further to just help your server to decode what your server wants. So in case of, if you're trying to log in, for example, if I go to, let's say if I just go to the dashboard and log out, and if I just try to log in again, what you will see is that in this case, when I enter anything and hit sign in, you would see if I go to this XHR area and go to this GraphQL, you would see we make another request. The same thing happens. In this case, you can see a different IP address is resolved, right? And right here in the request header section, you can see we have this information which is pretty much not interesting. You just have this header, the host header, but this request payload right here is the body of the information, which shows that what kind of data you're sending. And this is the kind of data which we are sending here in the request body. And what we get as a response is something you can see as a API response, right? So this is how you really debug, or this is how you really see under the hood what's happening. So if you ever haven't encountered any website which seems like unresponsive, or some button click is not working, and you think like it should log you in or log you out, the first thing you can do is just go to the right click inspect, go to this networks tab, perform that action again, and see if a backend request is made and if it is failing. Because a lot of developers, what they do, although they should not do that, but what they do is that they would just make the request and ignore the response, right? A lot of times server do send an error or this and that, but they don't really show it on the screen. In this case, we show it on the bottom right of the screen, what the server is saying. But sometimes if that is not happening, this is how you can debug it as a visitor. I mean, regular people would not have any idea on what's happening, but you as a developer can introspect a little and take a look under the hood. So once this all happens, just to give you a quick idea again, going back to the web pages part. So let me just quickly log in because I want to just quickly show you how you can uh, create a very simple HTML page and what does that mean. So once once the domain is resolved, once everything is done, what happens next is your browser starts parsing the response it is seeing, right? And you can spin up this playground for yourself as well from the codedamn.com/playgrounds. What this area is basically is just a temporary space of practicing and messing around with anything you don't want to have on your system. So you can see we have like 3 files here, which are like the building blocks of web, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So whenever you make any sort of edit over here, this web page on the right, which is embedding it, reflects it, right? And if you open this web page in a new tab, what would happen is that you can see we have a weird URL in the Omni box of the browser. So that doesn't matter, but what matters here is that whatever response you have sent from the server, this is what we wrote, right? This is the exact same thing which we wrote over here. So this is the first thing which the browser sees, and it tries to parse this into a tree, right? And tree is a data structure. So your browser would try to parse this whole thing into a tree-like structure and create this hierarchy of whatever you're seeing. Now, the reason your browser does that after getting that HTML response is because it's much easier to traverse this tree and apply any sort of CSS changes. For example, just having a background of yellow over here. So this is like very easy for the browser to just go to this node and apply it rather than just computing everything from the scratch and from the start and just figuring out what needs to be done. Similarly, for JavaScript, you can see you have a lot of APIs using documents. So you have document.getElementById, document.querySelector. So what all of them are doing is they are querying on a tree called as document, right? So this is like document object model. DOM is a tree of HTML built built by browser. So it's like a very simplification of what's happening. But what you can understand is browser is doing a lot of work under the hood. First of all, it resolves the domain to an IP address. It connects to that IP address using appropriate headers. Then what it does is that when it gets this HTML document, it parses that into a DOM-like structure, a tree-like structure, which is called as DOM, document object model. And finally, it exposes this whole DOM API to two systems, to two engines. The first one is CSS, which is used to browse the web, which is used to like beautify the websites, not browse. And the second one is JavaScript, which is like you can see, I'm incrementing the counter. So the way I'm incrementing this is if you take a look, this just sets a set interval on every 1 second. We just update the count, right? So that's how, in a nutshell, a very simple website works end to end. So we have over here as well, you can see we have a server running, which just serves these assets statically, and this resolves to a particular IP address. If you even want to take a look at that, this resolves to a particular. Oh, I stopped the server. So if you refresh this, you can see this would resolve to a particular IP address. It sends certain headers. You can see that we have the host header over here. It was not visible in the other request. So this host header is important. Then we get this HTML as the response. Once the connection is established, browser creates that whole little DOM structure and gives the access to JavaScript and CSS to beautify and add dynamic functionality to it. So anytime you are building your next front-end application, when you have so much information about what's happening under the hood, you would actually be able to appreciate like the work you're doing, because some people just think that front end is easy or back end is easy. But when you actually truly understand that on the click of your button when you visit a website or when you change a website, it's just almost like a great feat of engineering going behind the scenes, and people don't even know about it. So as developers, this is like a huge motivation, I feel like, if you know about this, because you for the first time have, I would say, like advantage of building on top of all of this work which has already been done for you. So I think this is like a great time to be a web developer, because so much information, so much technology, let alone the content on YouTube and this and that, but so much of the infrastructure is available now, right? Which is probably happening for the first time, right? Because internet has been here for like what, 20, 30 years. So this is a very prime time to be a web developer, I feel, because you have a lot of new technologies, WebAssembly, this and that. But at the same time, the core basic infrastructure for the web is now almost available in every part of the world. So build an application on the web once, deploy it somewhere, share a URL, and basically anyone can access it on the planet. Doesn't matter if they are on phone, on browser, on desktop, on any other platform. So yeah, I mean, we focus a lot on the same thing on Codedamn as well. If you check out Codedamn, you would see that we have started with a full stack learning path. Full stack web development is a fancy way of saying a developer who can pretty much do anything, which is like front end and back end and a little bit of DevOps. And we do this interactively. That means that if you check out, for example, the HTML CSS course on Codedamn, you're going to see that we actually spin up the same environment, the same practice environment, in a couple of labs which we have, in the course labs which we have. So when you're learning about HTML or React or even Bash or Linux fundamentals or anything, unlike a traditional YouTube course, and this is just me messing around. So unlike a traditional YouTube course, you actually have the ability to write your code while you're learning, mess around just like I am, play with the code, do whatever you want, and we manage the whole practice area for you. So this never really happens on your computer. So that means even if you are on a low powered device, or you don't feel like setting up a development environment, we handle that everything for you. And we have like a lot of courses, and a lot of courses are also coming up. So if you go to full stack, you're going to see that over the backend side of things, we have the GraphQL. This course is coming this week. We have the GitHub Actions, how you deploy these websites, how you write secure web apps, a bunch of certification exams, which this would definitely help you in the interview part and getting a job and this and that. But to be honest, my motivation of creating a learning path like this is because it's really, really interesting to know a lot about web and full stack in general. So this is like our effort of building something which is unique and valuable at the same time, mixing that practice infrastructure, that hands-on practice thing, which is what this session was as well, with the right amount of theory and projects building, is, I believe, the best way to learn fastest. So that is something I wanted to also discuss. I think you will find all these links on the codedamn.com website, as well as on maybe in the chat. But you can start for free. Basically, you don't need to pay anything. So that is also like one big recommendation, I would say. Other than that, I think we discussed this. We demonstrated this. Other than that, a lot of people actually ask how to get started with web development and how to know all of these things in depth. So I would say this would definitely come with practice. This third point, you need a lot of practice over the time, and you need a lot of patience. You need to build a lot of things. You need to interact with the community. But in terms of resources, I would say like pretty much at this point, the resources are a lot. But Codedamn, the reason I recommend Codedamn is because we mix these two with the resources section as well. So if you're watching a YouTube video, or if you're watching a Udemy course, you're not really learning until you are also practicing it along the way, right? Some people do. Some people take out the effort to just set up their own development machine, spend hours debugging why the installation is not working for a package. Then they figure that out. That's fine. But people who are learning on Codedamn, they don't have to go through any of that. They just build and practice right in the browser. So yeah, I mean, spend more quality time learning on Codedamn and less time worrying about infrastructure and building everything. So yeah, this I think is really important in the initial days of learning web development or learning any technology, that you don't spend the time where it does not need to be spent. And finally, take feedback from the community, from your mentors, from anyone around which you feel like can be a value addition to your projects. Feedback as in like what could be improved, what should I have done differently, which tech stack I should have used, and so on. Yeah, I mean, I believe like this is a great time to be a web developer, honestly. And if you're somebody who has started with a little bit of front end or back end and you want to consider full stack, then Codedamn is definitely something I would recommend, the Codedamm's full stack learning path. So I think that I'll just keep the session until here. We discussed a lot of new things. I'm hoping for somebody who has never really seen the DNS and HTTP and under the hood side. At this point, I would like be willing to take up any questions if anyone has, technical or non-technical. It's fine. Let's answer a few questions. Ritesh or Swati?
Hello, that was such an incredible session, and it's quite evident from the number of questions we are getting. So, guys, if you have any questions, drop them now. It's a great opportunity, and you don't want to miss it. Firstly, someone has asked, can you please tell us what's the all new buzz and hype around Web3?
So I'm probably not the right person for Web3 right now because I have not really, I've not really dived into that whole ecosystem. Uh, the way I understand Web3 is, I mean, it might be a little offending to some people, but Web3 is basically like decentralization and everything. But the core of that is the blockchain stuff, and blockchain is like a cryptographic linked list where the previous items are cryptographically signed, so you cannot change that. I don't think there is 100% transition going to happen on Web3. I do think, however, there are a few interesting applications where Web3 is really good. So yeah, I mean, Web 2 and Web 3 would work really together in a way where one complements another. But yeah, I mean, the hype is really the hype right now. That's what I feel. So it's good. You can jump into smart contracts, solidity, this and that. But yeah, I mean, the application of blockchain is really good around certain cases and not so good at all for most of the things which it is used for.
Okay, so the next question is, do these numbers in IP are assigned in random or there is some pattern?
There are, of course, rules for IP addresses. If you learn more about how the IP addresses are formed, you will see that there are different classes of IP addresses, IPv4, IPv6. So there are definitely rules. It's not like completely random. You cannot just create 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000. That's an invalid IP address. But at the same time, I mean, it's if you're talking about the use case where um, getting a specific IP address or getting something when you're booting up an EC2 instance or a DigitalOcean droplet, then that IP you get just randomly. You're assigned a random IP until you just go ahead and request a specific IP, like Vercel has. Vercel has a specific IP 76, 76, 21, 21 because they would have probably registered it and requested it and bought it maybe as well for a large amount of money. So yeah, I mean, in general, IP addresses do follow rules, but as developers, you don't really care a lot about IP addresses as long as it's a public one.
Okay, so the next question is from Swagat. Can you please tell us what's the. Okay, that's the same question, I guess.
Yeah.
So question from Astha. Again, the same question. Okay, this is a new question. I'm too afraid with front end development. I enjoy back end though because I'm too bad at CSS. Is there any way to escape or master CSS?
Escape or master, just the black and white. Uh, I mean, you don't have to be a full stack developer. That's not the only option. Backend development is really, really interesting and important if you are able to do that. So I wouldn't worry a lot about just mastering CSS if I don't like it. If you like backend, however, I would try to crawl a little bit into cloud and DevOps area because that is where uh, the real money is as well, and a lot of infrastructure level things and a lot of good optimization happen on the infrastructure part as well. So it's not a necessity to learn CSS or HTML or any of that sort if you're not interested in that. But with that being said, make sure that you are really not interested in that by trying it yourself and you're not just taking somebody's word for it. So yeah, I mean, mastering CSS again, that boils down to practicing and figuring out a lot of stuff and learning from the right places. But if you don't have the motivation to learn, you would probably not be able to master it. So yeah, I would say like stick to what your strengths are, stick to backend, explore what can complement these strengths of yours, that is DevOps and cloud, and go with that.
Thank you for the answer. So the next question is from Akash. I noticed presentation is on browser as presentation colon 8000. How does that work?
So this is something I did not expect like you would notice, but the way this works is there's a special file on your system called. Let me see if I can show you that. There's a special file on your system called etc hosts, which contains the mapping of certain domain names, which where your computer would try to resolve them before anything. So if I just cat this etc host file right here, you're going to see this is the mapping which exists. This is not a large mapping for me. But when you write localhost in your browser, the reason it works is because this etc host file contains this 127.0.0.1 mapping. So what I did before this presentation is I also wrote presentations and mapped it to 127.0.0.1. And the interesting part of this is that your computer would try to, like we discussed the DNS part, the DNS journey, right? Your OS asks the DNS resolver, your DNS resolver asks this. So I lied there a bit. Your computer would first ask this host file that do you have that mapping of an IP address? And in every case, pretty much host would decline it because you don't have a lot of IP addresses here anyway. But if the host does contain an IP address, it will just return that. So in the case of presentations, I have this mapping to 127.0.0.1. So that's why it works and it loops back to the same computer. And if you don't know what this IP is, this IP is a special reserved IP. This class is, I think this whole range is reserved, but this IP maps to your own computer, which is running. So if I am browsing 127.0.0.1, I'm effectively just looping back to my own system, this system which I'm using. So the reason that is the reason it works. It will also work on localhost, and it will also work on 127.0.0.1 because all of them are the same thing. So
Cool, cool. So the next question is from Anonymous. What is DOM, and how does it work on web?
I think we talked a bit about that already in the session, but just a quick revisor is DOM is a tree constructed with this HTML, which is sent by the server to your browser. And the reason that tree is constructed is because your browser needs an efficient way for JavaScript and CSS to apply any styles or changes or any dynamic functionalities on your page. So it's not very effective to just work with a string like this. So if I want to style this as background blue and color white, it will be very difficult to just use regular expressions and reach here and try to figure that out. So instead of that, we store this whole structure in a tree like format. So you have a root node, then a couple of nodes. HTML is the root node, for example, then these are two children and so on. So this whole structure is called as DOM, and it is exposed via certain APIs to CSS and JavaScript.
Yes. So the next question is I found 3Js very fascinating. Any reasons why many websites are not based on 3Js?
I don't have a lot of experience with 3JS. I think it is a 3D animation library as far as I can remember. So, I mean, I wouldn't know like, you know, why a website would want to be built in a certain way or not. But mostly, I think when you get into the web development and the this whole performance and optimization part, what you will realize is that it is almost always a better decision to not use JavaScript when you don't need to, because JavaScript is fast language, JavaScript is great, but HTML, CSS are even faster, and browsers have been optimized to display HTML and CSS and process them almost immediately. JavaScript requires a downloading phase, a running phase, a compilation phase, a JIT optimization phase, so on. So most of the times, if you don't require a certain thing to be done in JavaScript, for example, a certain animation which can be done in both CSS and JS, you should prefer to go with CSS because browsers are much, much better in HTML and CSS world compared to JavaScript.
Okay, so just a quick question by Harshita Sharma, how to learn backend.
So I'll quickly plug in my YouTube channel and my YouTube video here as well. I did a detailed video on that, how to learn, basically the exact title, how to learn backend development as a front-end developer. You can just Google that. You can go to YouTube and look at Codedamn and the first few videos. So you'll find that answer because it involves a lot of interesting point. That's why I don't want to answer it in a short way here.
I hope Harshita, your question is answered. Moving on to the next question. It's from Pramod. I heard we ran out of IPv4 around 2011, 2013. I don't remember the exact year. What does that mean? How can one run out of random numbers?
Because those numbers are not random, right? Those numbers have a specific range. For example, one rule of IP addresses is your each block in an IP address can only be from 0 to 255 inclusive, right? So if you have an IP address like this 127.0.0.1, the maximum range of an IP address could be 0.0.0.0 to 255.255. Something like that. So obviously you don't have unlimited numbers over here. It has a specific range. So those are not random and those are not unlimited numbers. So that's why you wouldn't run out of IPv4 addresses. There have been the reason IPv6 was introduced was partly because of this, but still you would see like a major part of web does use IPv4 still. So
Okay, so
so
which technologies does Scordam use?
So I briefly explained about what we used for front end. We used Vercel, which is used by Next.js. Uh, I spoke it the other way. We use Next.js, which is built by Vercel. Um, for the backend, we use AWS and GraphQL. For handling the database operations, we use MongoDB and Mongoose. So we use a bunch of technologies in general, but most of our tech stack is built on TypeScript. So, I mean, our backends are written in JavaScript, our front ends are obviously in JavaScript, and so on. So, yeah.
Well, that was a really phenomenal, a good primer to getting into web and understanding how things actually go behind the scenes, right? And I myself had a few doubts cleared. So, thank you so much for being there. And I just wanted to bring this up quickly. So we have this small community at our college of all the enthusiastic developers, and we just launch something called as a starter kit. Basically, it's a compilation of all the resources that we ourselves are using, right? And of all the resources, we have Codedamn on top. So we ourselves are using your videos, and they have been a great primer. So thank you so much for having it out there. And yeah,
Thank you so
it
much
was
for having me.
yes, yes.
All right.
Cool. All right. See you then. Bye bye.
Bye.
Cool. Yeah, we had a fun little session out there. There are quite a few sessions that will be ongoing, but on to Swati for the session two.
So thank you guys for joining. If you have any questions unanswered, you can put them in the Discord server. Probably we can ask some of the mentors to answer. And the next session will be a mini event focused on team building. So do join for the next session. Till then, bye bye. Thank you for joining.
हाँ वहाँ पे
Okay.
स्क्रीन पे जाके बोलना मिनी इवेंट का कोड ये है बोल के नीचे चल रहा है
Yes.
एक बार बस
So we have this code where the live leaderboard session wherein we go ahead and like the people who are at the top of this, we go ahead and give them some cool swags and out there. So the code for this session is Defendo. You can see the ticker below with the code exactly. So make sure you go ahead and give it out there. The form for this would be circulated on the Discord. So please make sure that you have entered the code. Happy hacking. Bye bye everyone.